All right, welcome to the LS Carlson Law podcast. I'm the host, Kirk Pearson, and I'm here with our special guest, Will Tober. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Excited.
Why don't you talk a little bit about who you are, what you do, so that our guests or our audience has an idea of who you are?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work at a firm called Hughes Marino. We're corporate real estate advisors. And essentially what we do is we help companies who are occupying commercial space, primarily in office or industrial space or other highly specialized space, negotiate the best possible leases or purchases that they can that benefit their businesses and align with their business objectives. So essentially we're helping companies try to save money in those transactions.
How did you get involved working with Hughes Marino?
I joke that I landed as squarely in the box as a broker could land because of my background. I grew up in Orange County. I went to USC, and I'm sitting here in Orange County again as a commercial real estate advisor. But my path into the business wasn't conventional. So I actually went to school to study broadcast journalism. My dream at the time was to host College Game Day, work for ESPN, talk about sports for a living.
Well, you're almost there.
That's
you're
what
on
I was going to say. This is sort of like living a little piece of that dream now. So I'm pretty stoked on it.
Perfect.
But so went to school, realized pretty quickly it wasn't what I wanted to do. But I was pretty deep in the curriculum, ended up majoring with a degree in broadcast journalism. So just goes to show degrees don't mean as much as we sometimes make them out to be. And then funny enough, I had a roommate in the film school while I was at USC and who had pulled me into some film projects during this time. And one of them was about a pastor in South Korea who built a box on the side of his home that was designed to take in babies that would otherwise be abandoned. And we strapped together some cash through some fundraising platforms, ended up flying to Seoul, South Korea during college and made what we thought was going to be like a 10-minute short film. Turned out to be a 90-minute feature film, kind of carried me through my first few years post-grad. We ended up forming a nonprofit organization to leverage the exposure the film was generating into financial resources and kind of gave me this long off-ramp to figure out what was next. And it was also a unique experience because as a co-founder of this nonprofit, one of the things we had to do was find our own office space, and we didn't use a broker, and we had tons of challenges and issues arise as a result of that. So it was sort of on my radar. I was always attracted to real estate and this idea of entrepreneurship, right? Like working with business owners and business executives and leaders. And so ended up making the shift from that nonprofit background into the corporate real estate world where I now represent tenants at Hughes Marino. So again, ended up in a very kind of basic position, but my path into it was pretty unique.
Can you elaborate maybe on the types of situations you may get involved with as far as your clients go?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, essentially any company that is occupying space for its operations, whether it's headquartered office space, branch office space, if it's distribution, manufacturing facility, we can help support. We position ourselves as sort of outsourced real estate department for our clients. So anything related to those corporate real estate needs, there's an opportunity for us to add some value. Our core competency as brokers is, again, negotiating those leases or purchases when those transactions arise. But the way we've structured our firm has allowed us to support in a variety of other capacities along the way. We recognize that our business, unfortunately, and sort of naturally is transactional, but we really want to be more relationship based and come alongside these companies and help add value for them even during their 5-10 year lease commitment.
Yeah, well, being that we are a real estate law firm, among other things, we typically come in when a problem arises. So what are some issues that you see with your clients as you're kind of helping them, or what are some issues that come up frequently?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, unfortunately, and fortunately for us, I guess, a lot of times when we are inserted into a conversation, it's because a problem has come up. Fortunately, we're not the ones in most cases that are the cause of that issue, but there is a lot of cleanup in our business. I would say the most common things that come up are operating expense issues, right? Where there's this really tough to understand thing as a tenant of, okay, I'm paying my rent, but what are these other charges that are being passed through to me by a landlord, and what do they mean? And it's all very vague in many leases, and there's commercial real estate jargon and legal jargon involved. So it's hard for these tenants to sort of synthesize what the lease actually protects them from and what's available for them to negotiate in that process. So a lot of times it's situations where tenants are being overcharged, erroneously charged. They're in a position where something's gone wrong with the building. There's a big bill that suddenly shows up on their desk, and they say, "What is this? How do I get out of it? What can you do to help me?" And there's obviously things from the business term standpoint where we can step in, but we also rely on attorneys all the time to support us in those conversations. And obviously, when we're working with a tenant from the beginning, do everything within our power to get ahead of those issues. And then the other thing I'd say that's interesting right now, particularly, are issues related to some of what's happening in the office climate right now. There are lots of building owners who are defaulting on their loans because their office assets are not worth what they once were. And they're also selling these properties in many cases to developers. And there are specific clauses in these leases that can protect, and if you don't have them, may not be protecting you from losing things like your tenant improvement allowance, right? Or having your lease be null and void altogether in certain cases. So those are typically things that aren't as relevant in a stabilized market, but as you know, we're not in that right now. So there's a lot of other exposure that we see tenants run into in particular. And those are often, again, times when we're coming in and trying to clean up the mess.
What are some things that your clients could do? So, representing a business owner or somebody who's looking for a commercial space or who is in a commercial space, what are some things they can do kind of proactively to help protect themselves and maybe avoid some of these pitfalls?
So engaging a broker is, one of the first best things that you can do. I think also getting a head start on the process, right? I think we often see tenants wait too long, and I get it, right? It's hard to imagine that you need to start these conversations 2 years, a year in advance of when your lease actually expires. But the reality is, in order to do it right and to execute well and to avoid some of these pitfalls, it's a pretty crucial part of the process. I think if you are getting a late start, engaging a broker who's experienced, knows what they're doing, and who's really going to be able to advocate for your needs is a big piece of that. But I think getting, again, a head start on that process is pretty critical, and a common mistake we see a lot of people make.
Yeah, I think when we see issues like this arise, I would say the number one factor usually is the intent to save money or try to avoid a problem. Mm-hmm. And more often than not, it ends up costing them more money in the long run. So they're kind of short-sighted in trying to save money. Is that something that you see as well?
Yeah, totally. And I think that kind of aligns with the other pitfalls I was mentioning. I think a lot of the times tenants avoid even engaging a broker because there's this misconception about how they're going to be compensated and how that might impact the outcome of their transaction. The reality is, our commissions are earned only when we successfully complete a transaction for that client, and they're paid for by the landlord, right? So our clients in particular aren't paying those fees. But I think that does often result in, some of these problems where they didn't have that expert looking out for their needs, or they weren't able to get ahead of some of the potential problems, or there was just market ignorance, right? Like not understanding, hey, we're about to sign a lease in a building that's set to be torn down in a couple of years, right? And they just weren't aware. So yeah, there's a lot of unique problems that I think can be solved for just with taking a couple of those steps. But I agree. I think we tend to see, if you are purely pursuing a process that's going to, on the surface, save you a quick buck and maybe cause you to cut some corners, it's likely going to turn out to be more expensive in the end.
Yeah. Other than, maybe getting a broker involved, what are some other things you think business owners could do to kind of help avoid some of these issues that they face with their leases?
Yeah. A good real estate attorney for sure is a absolute key. They're going to come at this from a slightly different perspective than we would, right? And I think having that well-rounded team is important as well. There's all sorts of, I would say, layers to what can go wrong and how to avoid the problem. Like part of the reason we've structured our firm in the way that we have, in us being sort of this outsourced real estate department, is it is a pretty multidisciplinary process. Like I mentioned, the real estate attorney expertise, like having some level of financial expertise, design, architecture, construction. Like I will say a big point of exposure for our tenants is on the construction side as well. If you are going to be getting into a space that requires some significant renovations, making sure that process comes in on time and on budget is pretty critical, and a place where we tend to really see things get off the rails pretty quickly. I think, again, if you're going to approach it the way that you would approach any other transaction that you were going to make, and just relying and trusting on experts who do this regularly, like that would be my primary advice, right? So your attorney, your broker, a good architect, a good construction management company, GC, like all of those pieces are pretty critical to it going well. And even if it is going okay, going as efficiently and effectively as possible, you're going to need all those levels of expertise along the way.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And, I would second that. I think of all the disputes I've seen over the years, most of them arise from odd or unforeseeable situations of kind of anything you can imagine. And a lot of it could be resolved sooner or more easily if somebody, for example, has, like you say, a team involved.
Totally.
They've got good financial people involved. They've got a good lawyer to kind of help them. They've got good brokers or other people kind of advising them. And I've seen everything from, a construction accident during a tenant improvement that then ropes in the landlord, the company that's leasing the space, all of the contractors involved, to, like you say, just a project running over budget, or, something not getting done that was supposed to get done during the tenant improvement. And having somebody that you can then call right away, or who's involved in the process, while it seems expensive at the time, can end up saving money, in the long run.
100% agree. And I think there are even things like today, everyone knows we're in a really tricky insurance climate, for example.
Yes.
And many landlords are passing the bucket to their tenants in that regard. And so I've talked to a number of companies who the perception is sometimes, well, the landlord's telling me this is the lease, right? And I have to sign it, or that they're not going to make any changes. And so there's this misunderstanding on what's negotiable, what's not. And then there's also this lack of leverage that exists in those conversations to actually lead the landlord to make a change that benefits the tenant. So again, I think, having the right advisors in the room with you from the very beginning, even as you're starting to build a strategy on what your needs are and where you might want to locate, and, again, getting ahead of some of the unique factors that you wouldn't otherwise know about, I think is going to save you a lot of money in the long run.
No, I think that's excellent advice. What are some kind of market issues that you're seeing? You mentioned earlier this idea with, the office space and I guess it being converted to other uses. For example, I think a lot of us that are in this space have seen where they're converting office space into residential space. They're turning big office buildings into condos. But what are some other market issues that people may want to be aware of or be thinking about?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the office stuff is the thing that's typically the stuff that grabs the headlines, right? Like we read about it in the paper or online. I think that is very real, but it's better understood because we came out of this post-pandemic environment. Everyone understands that most of us have more flexible work weeks. We're working from home for certain periods of the week, or maybe permanently. Companies by and large have contracted, which is causing all of the issues on the office side. And that's significant. I think what most people don't understand is that we're in a soft market as far as the tenants are concerned everywhere, right? So even if you're in manufacturing or distribution, there's just a lot more opportunity out there than there has been over the last few years. We've been in a very volatile market cycle. Like real estate is normally fairly predictable. It's like these 7 to 10 year cycles, right? Where the market's building and building and building. Some event happens, it shoots down for a year or two, and then it starts climbing again. We've sort of been more in this volatile state for some time. So it's hard to keep up with those market fluctuations. But for example, some of the things that we're seeing right now, particularly on the office side, are opportunities for tenants to save money on their leases well in advance of their lease expirations. So we joke all the time, like lease expiration dates and the lease terms for that matter are pretty static, and yet companies' needs are pretty dynamic. And so most companies assume, hey, I signed my lease, it doesn't expire for 3-4 years from now, nothing I can do about it. But when it gets a little closer, I'll look to address whatever pain points exist for me. Well, there's actually opportunities right now to restructure those leases. You can think of it like a refinance on your home, right? Interest rates drop. There's an opportunity to kind of recast that loan. Similar structure on the office side, where if you're happy with the footprint that you're in, you can actually extend your lease and save significant money because of the gap in where lease rates were when those leases were signed, as opposed to where they are now and what's achievable today. Or similarly, if you needed to downsize space, right? We talked about a lot of companies are contracting. If you're in a footprint that's too big for you, even if you have several years of your lease remaining, there's likely an opportunity to downsize sooner rather than later, which can result in pretty significant savings that can obviously be redeployed in other areas of the business. I think the other thing that is important to know is tenants just have a lot more leverage today because there are more options. So I think, again, it's important to get started on these processes as soon as possible, because you won't really have a full grasp of the opportunities that exist in the market until you start that process, which is similar in every case, but also highly customized depending on that company's unique needs. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, it does. You mentioned a couple things that are negotiable. What are the types of terms that are generally going to be negotiable for a tenant in a lease, or that they might be able to revisit or kind of address, whether they're just getting into a space or already in a space?
Yeah, and I think the answer to that question is somewhat dependent on the market conditions, right? So that kind of dovetails into what we were just talking about related to where we are today. I think I wouldn't say everything's on the table, right? But a lot more than people think, right? And when we have clients working with attorneys to review these leases and provide comments, they're looking at everything. And at minimum, right, want to be upfront about, hey, here's where there's potential exposure. This is a market term we're seeing. Probably not going to be successful in adjusting the language much, but you need to be informed about what you're signing up for. But in most cases, there's opportunity to make those terms benefit a tenant or more friendly to a tenant. And I think the obvious ones are, of course, right, the rent, any lease concessions when it comes to free rent, moving allowances, tenant improvement allowances, parking, right? Like all of the economic terms of the lease, as we would categorize them, are of course up for discussion. But I think, again, touching on like operating expenses, for example, there's tons of language that can be added to these contracts that protect you from scenarios that might feel unforeseen, that could save you far more money than any lease negotiation on the rent itself might save you long term. So there's equal importance, I would say, across the board in terms of the direct economic terms, as well as some of the things that might feel a little bit more standard, where there are still tons of ways to customize to create a safer environment for that tenant. Yeah.
Can you elaborate on what you're talking about when you're talking about operating expenses as it pertains to these leases?
Yeah.
I'm assuming those are things like CAM expenses, that sort of thing.
Of course. Yeah. So there are.
I just used an acronym, which is terrible. So maybe you can elaborate
common
on
area
that.
maintenance, CAM. Yeah, that's actually more often how people have heard it before. The common area maintenance is almost more of a foreign term, so I think the acronym is appropriate in that case. So yeah, anytime you sign a lease, right, your rent is covering certain things, right? There's several different types of lease structures. The most common for office space, for example, is a full service gross lease, in which case your rent, at least for the first year of the term, is designed to cover your property taxes, your property insurance, your common area maintenance, utilities, and janitorial, right? So that's all intended to be bundled into that rate that you're agreeing to. Now, in an office lease, there's typically something called a base year, and that's the period of time, it's usually a calendar year or a fiscal year, when a landlord is calculating the expenses that it costs to maintain the property. And then in the years following your base year, each tenant is responsible for covering the increases in those expenses relative to their pro rata share in the building. So even in a full service gross lease, you're going to have operating expense pass-throughs. Now, some of the things that I've touched on related to exposure in the operating expenses, is replacing the roof an operating expense? Is replacing the HVAC an operating expense? Is the landlord deciding to build a gym in the building considered an operating expense? How those things are defined in the lease are critical, because assuming the landlord's planning to invest in the property or maintain it on any level, there's huge exposure because those are big ticket items, right? Or another example would be, what if the landlord adds earthquake insurance at some point during the term? Who pays for that? Can they pass that through to the tenants? And if in a full service growth scenario, if those expenses aren't already being incurred in the base year, then depending on how they're defined in the lease, the landlord could have an argument to pass those through. And we review these types of expenses all of the time. And even when the language is right and the tenant is protected, there's still tons of situations where landlords are passing through those costs inadvertently, negligently. I don't know, but you need to check on them regularly as well. And it makes sense, right? Even if it's an innocent mistake, landlords are managing oftentimes hundreds of thousands of square feet, millions of square feet of assets. And each lease might have unique language when it comes to some of these expenses. So oftentimes they're not abiding by that unique language when they're executing on these pass-throughs. And then similarly, like triple net leases, you're paying for all of the things I described, those property taxes, property insurance, common area maintenance, utilities separately and in addition to the rent that you're providing, which creates a whole different conversation around how to protect yourself, right? Like oftentimes in those triple net leases, landlords are deferring a lot of the maintenance responsibility and replacement responsibility for some of these building systems to the tenant. So then it becomes crucial to negotiate proper warranty language, make sure you're getting inspections done on the property. Like there's a lot of different things that aren't obvious heading into the process that you really ought to do in order to make sure you're protecting yourself.
Yeah, that's great advice. I mean, I've been involved in disputes over the years where these kinds of situations are just ripe for litigation or legal disputes, because what could happen, for example, in a triple net situation is the entity that owns the property decides they're going to do a full revamp of the parking structure, and it's a 10-story parking structure, and it's going to cost tens of millions of dollars, and they're now going to pass those costs on or try to pass them on to the tenants. And you've got to be really familiar with what the lease allows for and doesn't allow for, and be kind of watching those things, because sometimes tenants and clients of ours have gotten sticker shock when they get a notice from the landlord, like, hey, you've got to pony up, however much money that was not anticipated or foreseen because they're doing some big capital improvement project. And it can come, by way of insurance too.
Totally. And I've found, and I would, assume the same on your side, but the precision in the lease language is often pretty critical, because there's sometimes multiple ways to interpret some of the language that's in these leases, right? And
I'm shocked.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And
that's sarcasm.
And we get into situations all the time where, tenants bring us in, they say, hey, here's how I'm reading the lease. Is that how you are reading it? The landlord's saying that this doesn't cover what I think it covers. So again, on the front end, as much as possible, when you can address some of these things in a precise manner, you're going to be saving yourself at minimum a headache down the road.
Yeah. And look, sometimes that the uncertainty or the vagueness in the lease can be on purpose. Totally. And sometimes it's on accident. Right. And it's hard, I think, for most people to distinguish between the two, or then, understand like, well, what do we do next? And this can affect people, that are, dealing with like a Brookfield who owns like a giant high rise in downtown LA and is a very well-established, very corporatized sort of landlord, all the way down to just like a one-off, small strip mall, in the Inland Empire here in Southern California. Right. These aren't issues that are exclusive to, one type of landlord or tenant versus another. It comes up in lots of different scenarios. So I think, this goes to, having somebody like you, having a good attorney involved that can help answer these questions as they arise, and then, watch out for it.
Totally. I mean, it's like anything else. Preventative care is going to be the most effective way to solve for these things. But even when you are in a situation where you're caught and it feels like you don't have any options, reach out to an attorney, to a broker, to an expert to help you navigate. Because I find that even when some of these situations do feel hopeless, there's compromises, there's ways to get out of these situations without, causing too much disruption.
Yeah. And I will say from the legal side, when we've had clients reach out to us, we're oftentimes able to negotiate things for people. That's not always the case, but sometimes they'll get a scary letter from like the landlord's legal counsel, and they're trying to be scary on purpose, or sometimes they're just mistaken in the position they're taking. And usually there's room, like you say, to negotiate or discuss like a resolution that can be beneficial if a problem does arise.
In times there's not, right, too. And that's what we tell our clients sometimes. It's, hey, I think your interpretation of this provision in the lease is correct. I can't force the landlord to abide by our interpretation. And if they're going to take a different interpretation for that provision, sometimes the only way to create that situation where they're going to honor those terms is through litigation, which is obviously, not anyone's first choice, but having someone in your corner that can go fight for you in those cases is sometimes necessary. Yeah.
And look, you mentioned litigation. I think most business owners want to avoid litigation, and part of having a good team around you can help you decide whether the litigation is worth it or not. Because I've had clients where sometimes it's worth litigating, and there's other times where it's very clear the landlord just wants them out of the building because they're changing the use or what they're doing with it. And sometimes it's better to just
cut your losses.
Get a good broker agent involved, go find a new space with a landlord that's going to work with you more. Do you see those sorts of scenarios come up?
For sure. Yeah. Like I said, especially now, right? I think there are, especially on the office side, a lot of landlords that are looking to reposition their assets just because there's not a lot of interest or demand from the typical institutional players to invest in that type of product anymore. So there's a lot of redevelopment that's happening, and there are things like pesky renewal options that sometimes get in the way. And even though a tenant has the right to continue occupying a certain space, if the landlord wants to redevelop it, they can make your life quite uncomfortable in the interim. And so most tenants don't understand that in those cases, as painful as it might be to have to move, if it's inevitable, you can be incentivized to do so, right? And that's when involving someone like our firm will help in maximizing what's available to you to make that move a little less painful, a little less costly. But that's a huge piece of what's going on in the market today.
Yeah, you mentioned insurance too. What are some issues that business owners should look out for as it pertains to insurance and the changes in the insurance landscape in California?
Yeah, I mean, there's a variety of things. Like I just recently came across an issue where a landlord in a triple net lease who obviously passes through their property tax costs was up for their insurance renewal. Their insurance company came and said, hey, you need to upgrade X, Y, and Z with the building. And then the landlord tried to claim that this was then the tenant's responsibility. And it was, not a cheap item, right? Like updating sprinkler systems, updating electrical, like all of the insurance companies are essentially requiring their customers to self-insure. And they're not saying it, right? Like you're still going to pay a premium, but they're requiring such crazy upgrades to these buildings to essentially make them brand new and trying to mitigate the risk that there will be any kind of disaster, which is great, but there needs to be some specific language and a way to navigate through that process where as a tenant, you're not sitting in someone else's building, making all of these upgrades and just left holding the bill for the insurance company to then finally insure the landlord, right? That's just one example. I think I mentioned earthquake insurance, right? We live in Southern California and earthquakes are a part of life, and it's a very expensive insurance line item. And if you're not accounting for the potential to add coverage like that through the life of the lease, again, you could be left with a massive pass-through cost. So those are a couple examples, but yeah, insurance is a crazy topic right now. And I don't think anybody's, quite figured it out, but it's definitely something that you need to be aware of and that should factor into how you're making your decisions and thinking about real estate.
Yeah, I mean, insurance is, I think, touching not just residential properties, which we've seen a lot of in Southern California with the fires in LA, Altadena and the Pacific Palisades have burned to the ground. There's lots of insurance issues around that, but it is affecting commercial properties as well. Those also burned in the fires that we had up in LA. And it's been a longstanding problem, I think, all throughout Southern California with some of these insurance companies pulling out, now coming back in.
Yeah,
California loosening how the insurance is being priced.
Yeah, bottom line is it's more expensive, right? And if costs are increasing for the landlord, they're going to try to figure out a way to pass it through to the tenant, right? That's just kind of the name of the game. So again, being able to protect yourself in those situations is the primary way we interact with that insurance question.
Other than maybe the increased control or options that are available to some of your clients or business owners, what are some of the bright spots you see in the commercial real estate market moving forward?
I think there's a lot more creativity when it comes to how we're thinking about space or designing space, how we're amenitizing space. Like one of the unique developments in the office side as it pertains to the market is like this flight to quality, right? So the companies that typically are still occupying some level of office space are gravitating towards the nicer product with more amenities. So I think long term, that's causing landlords to think more seriously about creating better tenant experiences for the tenants that are in their buildings in an effort to attract those tenants, right? It's not as simple as, hey, well, my building's cheaper. It's like, well, you can save money now by downsizing your space and still moving into a more expensive building. So if there are any winners on the office side from the landlord community, it's those that own this like class A plus space. And I think that'll have a positive net impact on the industry as a whole. I think, from the industrial side, that things got so expensive for a period of time that it was almost impossible to earn a profit as a business that occupies some of this space. So the fact that those prices have come down has, I think, allowed for these businesses to, again, invest in growth and other things that will be a net benefit to the customers like us. And I think, there's also been situations where it's a little bit easier to imagine operating in the United States, for example, as opposed to offshoring some of the, the manufacturing or the even the distribution in some cases. So I think, in any market, there's going to be opportunities. You could also argue, tenants can often become buyers, right? Like there's some great options out there for them when it comes to prices and availability on that front too. So tons of opportunity in any market, but particularly in the down ones for the occupiers of space, there's a lot of room for creativity and just opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. If people want to get in touch with you or find you, how can they get in touch with you?
I'm easy to find. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on my website, hughesmarino.com. I'm in the Orange County office. I could, leave my email or phone number behind as well. But yeah, I'm all around the Orange County community and always looking to build relationships.
No, that's great. And look, I think we're big advocates for, again, building that team around you. So many of the problems we deal with kind of on the back end when things go bad or blow up could be resolved if you have a good broker, if you have a good accountant, if you have a good lawyer that are kind of helping along the way, because they'll be able to say, hey, look, here's a red flag or here's a situation to watch out for. And so, I always encourage people to go, find good people to work with that you trust, and then listen to the recommendations they're providing you. They know what they're talking about. Well, thanks for taking the time, Will. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
And hopefully people will reach out to you. Again, this is Kirk Pearson with the LS Carlson Law podcast. We're grateful for Will Tober being here with us.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate you having me.